everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. I've got a collection of mouse guns on the table here, chambered in 380, starting with the Kel-Tec P3AT, which is actually one of the ones that kind of started the mouse gun, pocket gun in a reasonable caliber. They came out quite a while ago, and at the time they did, that was it. There really wasn't anything else in the ultralight, ultra-small market that wasn't chambered in something like 32 or 25 or even 22. There were guns chambered in 380 like PPKS and others, but they were usually much larger and much heavier. So it's not the greatest gun on the planet, but it actually is, at the time that it came out, really your only good choice. A little bit after that, Ruger then came out with the original LCP. Now this one here is being called original LCP. The first original LCP had a much heavier trigger than this one. They kind of improved the trigger a little bit in the same original LCP from the very, very first ones, because we tried one quite a while back, but we don't have one of the very first original LCPs. Then the next level of evolution beyond that, they went on and created the LCP Custom, which basically was an LCP, an original LCP with a little bit nicer trigger. And in addition to it, it had a prettier trigger. It had this aluminum skeletonized trigger, but also the trigger pull and trigger feel was better. And now you've got, of course, in the current generation, you've got the LCP2, which has that same basic trigger feel and pull of the LCP Custom, but it has a Glock style inertial pull prevention safety and some ergonomics and some other changes. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with the Kel-Tec and describe it a little bit and talk about how these guns are very similar and the primary differences between them. But one of the things that you say when I get them apart, I'll take apart the Kel-Tec and the original LCP. The LCP looks like a blatant clone of the Kel-Tec just looking at the parts. I got no information that confirms that it is or is not, but when you just look at the internal components and the barrel and everything else, Ruger had at least seen a P3AT when they generated this gun, but they did then evolve. And that's the thing that Kel-Tec hasn't. If I buy a Kel-Tec today, it's going to be identical to this one. If I buy the Ruger, I can move up to the LCP, which has a number of improvements you'll see as we talk through it. So where Ruger took what might have been close to the Kel-Tec to start with, they've evolved, and Kel-Tec has not. Now I'm going to go ahead and pick these up and we'll start talking about it and looking at it, but of course for safe gun handling procedures we'll clear each one of these before we do anything further with it. So we have cleared the Kel-Tec. We have a clear original LCP. We have a clear Custom. And we have a clear 2. So now we can go ahead and just start talking about these things. Let's start with dimensions. From a dimensional standpoint, they're all so close together as that it really doesn't matter. They're between 5.15 and 5.18 inches long, 0.78 to 0.9 inches thick, with the new LCP2 being the thickest of them. And they're all 3.57 to 3.72 tall, with the new LCP having this little bit longer base plate, and of course the magazine base plates themselves are a little bit thicker at the tallest. But we're talking hundredths here. So if you're trying to figure out what's going to fit in your pocket, what's going to fit where it's going to go, the size differences between them really isn't going to matter. From a weight difference, they're all fairly close. The Kel-Tec still comes in at the lightest, 9 ounces, which even today, in today's technology, is actually still pretty light as small pocket guns go, on up to the heaviest of them, the LCP2, at 10.7 ounces. But we're talking about a spread of about an ounce, ounce and a half, at 1.7 ounces. So it's not a really big difference. If you're absolutely positively need the very lightest thing you can get, then you're going to be down here into the Kel-Tec, because even the original LCP, which comes in at 9 ounces, or actually 9.9 ounces, I'm sorry, and then the LCP Custom came in at 8.75. I'm sorry, 9.75. So the Kel-Tec is the lightest of the batch. It shows though when you shoot it. The Kel-Tec is definitely the least comfortable, the least pleasant to shoot, and that little bit of extra mass and slightly different ergonomics of the Rugers make them a hair better to shoot from a comfort standpoint, slapping this part of your hand and, kind of beating you around. From a sights perspective, the Kel-Tec has by far the worst sights. They're a barely noticeable gutter sight. And, an argument could be made that these things are belly guns. Well, all of these are actually able to be shot accurately at reasonable distances if you can see the sights. If you move up to the Ruger is a slight improvement. Then this is the original Ruger. It's a slight improvement, but unfortunately the sights are black. But you do have a little bit higher sight height and a little bit more definition of the beginning of the sight versus the top of the slide. Makes it a little bit easier to acquire them. The Custom took that to the next step with actually having fairly tall rear sights, and that front sight is a phosphorescent, so it's photoluminescent. You charge it up with light. I think over the years this one has kind of aged a little bit and it isn't as bright and phosphory as it might have been at one time. And then when you move on to the LCP2, it has roughly the same sights as the LCP, it's just that they've got a serration on them which is meant to reduce glare. Unfortunately, that serration has a tendency to make the front sight want to fuzz out. So what would potentially have been an improvement in the sights actually is a bit of a detriment. You notice how that front sight just kind of fuzzy and not clear. Now you zoom all the way in and get the rear sight out of focus, and then the front sight reappears. So it's a little bit difficult to keep both sights in focus while you're, along with the target. So none of these have stellar sights. The only thing I will say about the Custom is Custom's the only one that did have a drift adjustable sight. All the rest of these, the sights are fixed, so what you see is what you get. And other than painting white dots on things, or black dot maybe in the case of the Kel-Tec, the sights are the way they are, and that's the way they're going to be. Now, a couple of things about these guns. The Kel-Tec and the Custom were loaned to us by a local viewer, and that viewer put this grip sleeve on the Ruger to make it a little bit more comfortable to hold for him. And of course, we're not going to modify that. We're not going to take that off. And this is his Kel-Tec just the way it sits. And when we return it to him, he will go back to carrying this. He carries this along with a couple other things. He's carrying one of his other guns now while we have it in our possession. And then these two we recently picked up. So that's kind of, the genesis behind these different guns. Let's talk about capacity a little bit. Of course, guns this small are not going to be high capacity. And when you first saw them, we were sitting on screen, we had the Pinky Extender magazines. That all of these do come with a Pinky Extender magazine. And we had the Pinky Extender magazines installed in all of them. And all of them have a little bit of a curvature to the base. And all of them in these Pinky Extender magazines, the way you see them configured, hold 6 rounds, plus 1 in the pipe. All of these are double action only, and none of these have restrike capability. So all of them, despite being hammer guns, they're all hammer guns, they're all double action only, but once the trigger is pulled, if it doesn't fire, you have to cycle the gun, just like a striker gun, to make it operational again, and that's consistent across all of these. The Ruger LCP2, and only the Ruger LCP2, support a 7-round magazine with a Pinky Extender on it. Now, an interesting note about this, the LCP and LCP2 6-round magazines are interchangeable, but the LCP2 has a feature that none of the guns on this table do. Locks back. All the rest of these don't lock back. They'll just cycle on the last round and they'll close up like they're ready to go and click and no bang. The LCP2 magazine in the LCP will not make it lock back, and the LCP magazine in the LCP2 will cause this one, the new one, to not lock back, but it'll function properly. But you cannot use the 7-round magazine in the older LCPs. It won't work reliably. So it kind of gives you a little bit of background on that. And one thing you'll also notice, the LCP2 has a slide-stop slide release. The LCP does. So does the other LCP. The Kel-Tec does not. So if it doesn't lock back, and if you want, you really can't lock it back. So kind of from a capacity standpoint, with the LCP2, it does bring you to the ability to have one more round than it does with any of the others, but not by, that's not a significantly large margin. So let's look at, I'm going to take a couple of these apart and look at the internals. What I'm going to do is they all come apart the same way. So I'll just take one of them apart so you can see how it happens, and then I'll put one of them back together, and then I'll just stop and I'll take all of them apart and resume so I don't bore you to death. But they all work basically the same, where you have to pry out this pin, and I do mean pry it out. The Ruger at least has a cutout. All the Rugers have a little cutout to make it easier to get something under there, whereas the Kel-Tec, it's smooth and it fits real flush up. So I've got this little plastic pick that I'm going to use right here. Actually, I'm going to use this plastic pick, but you'll see how flush that fits. If you use a screwdriver, you're going to scratch your gun. So you're going to need something plastic to get to it. And that old adage that you see, you know, you'll shoot your eye out, is quite true with this. It takes a lot of force to get it to pop loose, and when it comes loose all at once. So when you do it, you know, hook the whatever it is you're going to pry with under it. Make sure you put a thumb or finger over it, because it'll want to fly in your face. But you pop the pin up, pull the pin out, and then they just slide apart. So I'm going to go ahead and get, you know, a few of these apart for comparative purposes, and then we'll pick back up. So I've got apart the Kel-Tec, the original LCP, and the LCP2. The custom internally, other than the trigger, is basically the same as the original LCP, so, you know, keep things a little bit simpler. But let's do, look at the frames. So I've got the LCP frame and the Kel-Tec frame, and you can see there's a little bit of difference in where the hammer sits on one versus the other, a little bit of difference in the various reinforcements, but overall they're very close to one another. They're not parts interchangeable, so you can't put the Kel-Tec slide on the Ruger and vice versa. And you also cannot use the Kel-Tec magazine in the Ruger or vice versa. So there are some differences, but I'll kind of turn them a little bit so you can see. But you'll see the overall footprint and pattern of them is very close. They've done a little bit different with the trigger guards on the Ruger versus the Kel-Tec. If I put these down and I pick up the barrels, other than, of course, the coloration, the barrels look nearly identical. There's a little bit of difference in the way the recoil spring assembly mounts on them. When you look at the side profile, they're quite similar. So there are minor differences, and that may have been part of making sure that there wasn't any claim that one was an exact clone of the other. You look at the slide, a little bit of difference in the back where the firing pin assembly is. But if I tilt them a little bit so you can see the slide guides and everything, very, very similar. Different enough that they're not compatible, but really close in manufacturing. Now if I take the LCP in this hand and the LCP2 on top, you'll see that there's minor differences, if any, between the LCP and the LCP2. A little bit of difference in the back, minor difference in the way the guides are beveled at the front, and some differences in the frame supports. And the barrels appear to be nearly identical. Set them side by side. The barrels look almost absolutely identical. I don't think they really changed anything in the barrel. Side profile. And then if I take the slides, I've got the LCP slide and the LCP2 slide. That I would say has the most noticeable difference. The strip of ramp is a little different on the LCP2, which is this one, than the LCP. But overall, even the slide guides are roughly the same. So there's not a lot of difference between them. It's mostly difference in springs, angles, and the way they've constructed the fire control group to get a particular behavior of the triggers. So it kind of gives you an idea of the differences across them. And I'll show you a couple of the barrels. One thing you're going to notice, and this is the Kel-Tec barrel, is that the barrels are very, very thin. You know, look, the material is quite thin. They are conventional rifling, so if I can get it where the camera can see it. They're conventional rifling. And if I, there's you could see. Now if I put that down and pick up the LCP2, or I'm sorry, this is the original LCP barrel. It's just as thin. You can see the rifling a little bit better because it's black, so it kind of stands out a little bit better than the silver, but the rifling is roughly the same. And then if I take the LCP2, I see no fundamental differences. But it's also, they're all conventional rifling, and they're all relatively thin with this little bit of flare to improve lockup at the end, to somewhat claim to improve a little bit of repeatability of your shots. So you've got some very similar guns. So I'm going to pick one, I'm going to put it back together, and then I'll put all the rest of them back together so we can resume. But I've got the LCP2, we'll put that one back together. And it's fairly easy. You know, the barrel just drops in. Now the recoil spring can be a little twitchy. It's a double recoil spring. All of them are the same, steel rod. You have to line the spring up and kind of push it forward without catching the barrel and get it to land on this little shelf. Not difficult necessarily, but it's kind of squirrely, especially in the initial thing when there's nothing guiding the front of that spring. And then, assuming you lined it up correctly, you just slide it back together. Take the pin, put the pin in, and this part can be a little twitchy, getting the pin to go in. Sometimes you gotta kind of play with the slide a little bit. And if you put the pin in, make sure it goes all the way and goes flush. It can go in about 3/4 of the way and act like it's okay, but it'll either fall out while you're cycling it or it'll cause it to jam. If it goes all the way in, there's a little rim on it. If I grab this other pin, you see that little rim there, and there's a spring inside the frame that this catches on. What it wants to do sometimes is hang up just before that and not go all the way in. And if you don't get it to drop all the way in and then go past it, it will have a tendency to hang up or come out. All the rest of these go back together identically. So let me put them all back together and pick up where we left off. So let's go talk about the triggers. And the triggers are actually different on every one of these guns. And interestingly enough, some of the ones that have a heavier trigger feel better than those with a light. So it does, one of the things that'll prove when we're talking through this is that the number, the weight of the trigger, isn't always the most important attribute. We don't, dry fire guns we don't own. Some of these, the Rugers are rated for occasional dry fire, not continuous dry fire. So I got these dummy rounds, or snap caps, and I'm going to use these in all the guns just to be consistent, especially because the Kel-Tec and the LCP Custom don't belong to us, and we never dry fire a gun that doesn't belong to us, because many owners are sensitive to that, and so we respect that if you're willing to loan us your gun. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the Kel-Tec. I'm going to start kind of do this in chronological order. So I've got the Kel-Tec P3AT chamber, one of those snap caps. And what you'll see is the trigger has a little bit of take up. The trigger is actually right in the 5-poundish territory. But if I gave you this gun, told you it had a 5-pound trigger and set you at the range, you wouldn't believe me, especially after shooting it. It's long, it's inconsistent, it starts in one zip code and finishes in another, but that was actually a 5-pound trigger. One of the things, and of course the reset on this feels like it's reset there, but it really hasn't. You have to come all the way out for that second click. So if you're used to working with Glocks and things like that, where you can kind of feel that or hear that click, it will mess you up. In fact, when I shoot the Kel-Tecs, I'll have a habit sometimes if I'm not paying attention to do that. I'll feel that first click and I'll try to pull the trigger and it won't work. So you're basically all the way out, and then you've got that same heavy feeling, even though it's 5 pounds, mainly because it's so long and because it's inconsistent. It changes as you pull it. It heavy, lighter. It's just kind of a weird trigger. It is a little difficult to keep this thing on target, and throughout that entire long trigger pull, it can be a little bit disconcerting. I'm going to go ahead and slap these two snap caps into this Ruger mag, because we'll use this same Ruger mag through all of them, because remember, you have interchangeability of the 6-round mag. The only difference is whether it will or won't hold open. Now this is the original LCP. Now this one actually has about an 8-pound trigger and a little bit of take up, but you'll notice it's a lot shorter. So even though it's a heavier trigger, it's shorter and it's consistent, and it actually feels pretty good. Just like the Kel-Tec though, resets all the way out and you got to wait for that second click, because you saw when I went to pull the trigger it wasn't right, and then I let go of it, you had that second click. But being a little bit shorter and being a little crisper actually makes it feel better. We were able to, other than a little bit of difficulty seeing the sights, once we were able to figure out how to see the sights, we could actually pull a little bit better groups with the LCP. Now if we move our way up to the Custom, which is the next of the evolutionary line, what Ruger had done with that is not only did they make the trigger just kind of cool, but they improved it quite a bit. So there's your take up. This trigger comes in around 6 pounds. It's about the same length as the regular LCP, but it's a little bit smoother and a couple pounds lighter. So this trigger has got a weight closer to what the Kel-Tec is, but overall it's just a nicer feeling trigger. And the owner of this LCP Custom had looked at the LCPs and the original LCP, and kind of dismissed it because of the trigger. It was heavier, and he was actually liked the lighter Kel-Tec even though it was longer. But he bought this gun when it came out because the trigger actually was improved enough to make a difference for him. And the reset on this is identical to the other one. You have to let it all the way out. You have to make sure you let it all the way out to get that second click. So now let's move on to the LCP2. Now the LCP2 has the split trigger just like the Glocks and many others. And that's to prevent an inertial pull. The gun lands butt side down, that the trigger's mass doesn't cause the trigger to pull itself. A little bit of take up. It's very smooth and light take up, and that little split trigger thing just goes away as you pull the trigger. And then you pull back. It's really short and really crisp. It's still a 6-pound trigger, but it's much, much nicer than the custom. So, as we look forward in the evolution of this trigger actually is a very nice trigger. Oops. That was I short-chucked it because I had it upside down. So let me go ahead and clear that. That was my bad. There we go. I'm going to do the reset. Kind of give it a good pop. This one actually did reset there, so you got a little bit shorter reset. You notice I went back out and there wasn't a second click. So I'm going to pull the trigger. I'm going to reset it one more time. There's the reset, and it's actually a viable trigger. So not only did the LCP2 make the trigger a little bit crisper and maintain that 6-pound weight of the custom, they actually made a decent reset. So of the evolution of this, that's a significant improvement overall with the LCP2 trigger. So that's kind of just how they've gone along. Now the only other thing they've changed is some of the styling. The texturing's a little bit different. The magazines. This is the LCP magazine, but the magazines that come with this gun have kind of like a squared off little bit of base. But it's all styling. They also added the front serrations that you'll notice none of the other guns have any kind of front serrations. They've added the front serrations. So for the press check guys, you got your press check. Overall, shooting these from a shooting impression standpoint, this one was the hardest to shoot well, but when it came to triggers, the Kel-Tec had a lighter trigger, but it was so long that it was just kind of difficult to stay on target with it, compared to the original Ruger. Neither one of the first two were easy to see the sights. It just, they're just not good sights. When we moved up to the custom, we actually started to be able to pull some groups, other than the fact that that front sight wanted to fuzz out on us. So you had to work a little bit, do this kind of lift and tilt thing to kind of find that front sight. And we had a similar problem with the LCP2. I will say that it was easiest to pull decent groups with the LCP2 and the custom, mainly because of the improved trigger and having at least sights that stuck up off the body enough that you could actually, figure it out and find something, versus trying to basically look down the back of the gun. So I would say of the ones that are here on the table, you can still get the Kel-Tec, and if you buy one today, it'll probably be identical to this one from 20 years ago. You can still get the original Ruger that's kind of like a revised original Ruger. The custom, you're only going to get it used. In fact, if you go to Ruger's site, the custom really doesn't even exist anymore. It's like it never happened. And the LCP2, of course, is their current production gun. So let's talk about pricing. The Kel-Tec will cost you about $275. If you just street price. It's hard to get MSRP on some of these. The original Ruger would cost you $199, up to about $233 if you get one with a stainless slide. So I'm going to say if budget is the absolute decision maker and you really can't afford much more than that, between these two I would take the Ruger. It's a little bit more refined than the Kel-Tec. But if you can go up to about $250, another $50 more, you got the LCP2, you're going to get nicer trigger, nicer sights, better ergonomics, a reset, the ability to have one more capacity in the magazine. So, bottom line, for $50, this is significantly more gun than either of the other two that are still readily available, which would be the Kel-Tec or the original LCP. I imagine over time this original LCP is going to disappear. I bet you they're probably not manufacturing it anymore, even though I can't say for sure, and they're probably just selling what they've got, whereas the LCP2 is their go forward, at least in this line. And Ruger does have a habit of sometimes making history disappear. I mean, things like the LCP Custom, which was actually a decent gun for its generation, it just is like it never happened. You go to their site and there's no background information on it at all. And it was not a third-party modification. It was a Ruger. So, in summary, they're all suboptimal from a range day gun, but all of these fit the bill for, you know, gentleman's coat pocket gun in a very light gun that is actually in a reasonable caliber. 380 is an effective caliber. Yeah, I'd rather run around with 9mm or 50 AE, but as you know, I don't want to stop a 380, and it is effective in getting the job done. Beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell if you do. Thanks again to our subscribers and Patreon supporters for helping support the channel, and have a great day. Thank you.